This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Sarah Morris. Morris's films and paintings try to capture the way in which we conceptualize the physical space of locations, while trying to reconcile our imaginations in the reality of navigation. Her works are in the collections of nearly every major contemporary museum. In this coming year, we'll see major retrospectives in both Germany and Japan. And now, a parallax view of the art world with artist Sarah Morris. Just listening to you talk, it makes me wonder why Sarah Morris doesn't have a podcast.
That's a great question. Actually, I remember that Lawrence Weiner once told me, he came and heard, we were all in Switzerland, and he always used to say that artists were like expensive luggage, being shipped around the world. Obviously that has changed a little bit, but anyway, after we did this series of talks and I did my talk, he said, really, he didn't say podcast. He said, you should have a TV show.
Absolutely.
And I thought I'm not sure if that was like a backhanded compliment, but I'll take it as a compliment.
No, I mean, and it's funny because, I talk about this with people sometimes.
But he was a great talker also.
Oh, sure. And, I only wish I could have the bass in my voice that Lawrence had, right?
Yeah.
But,
yeah. And the questioning.
Sure. Well, in my 20s, I loved to stay up late every night and watch Charlie Rose. And I feel like, that's kind of where I found a love for interviewing. And, that show doesn't exist anymore because he got canceled for obvious, reasons. And, But you know what? There's a slot there for somebody like you to have interesting conversations with people because
there is.
You're the one with the philosophy degree and the well-traveled.
Well, I could do that if I wasn't doing all the other things that I'm doing. So it as you must know, with preparing for stuff and getting stuff organized. I mean, if you've done 50 podcasts in a year, that's a lot. Like that. I mean, I could almost. I mean, I've done several films so far with people of interest that have sort of come up peripherally with other films that I've done. So there's almost like a chain of filmmaking that in my mind isn't just a visual investigation. It is also hundreds of conversations that go on around the making of a film, around the understanding and navigation of space that I always find really interesting. I don't record those conversations. In a few instances, though, I have made them films, which notably was like Robert Town film, which I made after I shot the Los Angeles film. Mm-hmm. And he was in, and I realized I needed to have a conversation with him, which is a crazy story if you want to hear it.
Absolutely.
So basically in 2006, I was asked to do, for many years, I had been asked to do with Public Art Fund. I had been asked to do projects anywhere I wanted in Manhattan. Tom Eccles was sort of asking me, and I really wanted to do a piece in the Seagram's building, although there was only one spot available, which is where that tapestry, the Picasso tapestry, hung. And we couldn't get an answer about it. And I would never have been able to do like a wall painting or an actual intervention on the architecture. Mm-hmm. And so finally I said Lever House, because Lever House was like, mm-hmm. Out of, there's something really wrong about Lever House, right? It has a plaza. Now they use it as a restaurant, but back then it was a plaza that you think should be an entrance to a subway. It's not. It should be a bar or a restaurant. It wasn't. You should be able to cross the block quickly, but you can't because there's this like glass lobby. There's a number of sort of frustrating aspects to that building, although it was the first public plaza in Manhattan, from what I understand. And then it became sort of code to make public space whenever you made a skyscraper. But so as I was doing it, I came up with this idea to do one of the Los Angeles paintings called Robert Town, who had he was almost like a ghost when I was making the film. He was in so many conversations that I would have that Robert Town would enter the conversations. And I was, I obviously was always a huge fan of Chinatown. I can't think of a better film, really. And the whole idea about Chinatown is a frame of mind, was I think even a line in the film.
Right.
But I was always super interested in him. And then when I proposed to do this piece called Robert Town, which is of course a fictional name, it's not even his real name. He's I think it comes from a Russian Jewish background, and his name was, was adopted. So when I said the piece was going to be called Robert Town, the person who was in charge of Public Art Fund at the time said, you're going to have to get it okayed by him, which I was like, that seems really ridiculous. I mean, it was almost like a sort of litigious fantasy that he would say no and sue us. So anyway, I ended up calling Robert Town to get his permission to title the piece on Lever House Robert Town. And he said, I'd rather be on the ceiling than the floor. And that was sort of the beginning of a conversation which led to the making of the film, which I shot like a few months later. But it always struck me as sort of ironic to have this sort of fictional name called Robert Town in Manhattan on a building which sort of had produced, it was the headquarters for Lever House. I mean, Lever House was the headquarters of Lever, which was like a soap company.
Sure.
And obviously Robert Town had written the infamous Shampoo film in the late 70s.
Right.
So I had asked to do that. So like sometimes characters or people enter the films and I never have like a direct conversation with them. In other cases, there's many conversations with somebody about the making of a film and they're not an image, right? Like who becomes an image and what becomes an image is sort of, there's almost like an alchemical sort of process with how those decisions get made. But the conversations that go on sort of through the films and past them, become sort of a matrix for how I sort of move around and
Sure.
who I'm talking to and how I'm thinking about my work.
So you're bound to think about interconnectedness. I mean, even in the story that you're just talking about, Robert Town and Shampoo, I think I've heard you tell the story about how you were working on Los Angeles in 2004 and you're in Warren Beatty's office and he takes a call from Robert Town.
Yeah, that was in his library. Yeah, and I remember looking at this photo of Hockney that was in his library. And then he got a call from Robert Town, and Robert Town was out of town, so to speak.
Right.
He wasn't in Los Angeles. Otherwise, he would have possibly been in the Los Angeles film, but he was out of town, and he was somehow in South Africa shooting a film. And I heard this, like anybody from Los Angeles, they sort of like to do this spectacle of their phone call. So I got to hear, 20 minutes or 15 minutes of, a one-sided conversation about a very difficult film situation going on. I don't know whether it was an actor or an actress having an issue or whether it was a writer problem. But anyway, I sat in and I heard this whole conversation and I was very intrigued as to what was actually going wrong with Robert Town's film, And then I realized at some point I have to treat Robert Town as an epilogue, like Robert Town became this sort of key to the history of Los Angeles and the key to what would be better about Los Angeles if there were more people like him.
Sure.
You know?
So almost a lens to look through.
Yeah, and I mean, he tells he has so many interesting stories about everything from the history of his own career, but all the various people who sort of created 70s filmmaking in Hollywood. And also, he has very interesting stories about how he told me a story. I can't remember if it's it is partially in the Robert Town film. He tells me a story of how, like, Robert Evans sort of made his Robert Evans really made his career. Like, the deal that Robert Evans gave him allowed him to write pretty much for the rest of his life, based on Chinatown alone, because basically Evans offered him a share of the movie, which was apparently unheard of at the time. So sometimes these economic things, which are usually not talked about, certainly in the art world, they're fascinating because you also hear the history of an industry, like the history of, how he was operating, history of Paramount, and the history of, like, how that role came to be, which is basically like somebody being a script doctor, taking somebody else's material and working it. Now, obviously, Chinatown was written by Town, but he had already developed this career as, like, a fixer, as somebody who could come into a situation and, like, clean it up and get the dialogue right, get this scenario right. And that sort of intrigued me. And I sort of thought about that the role of the artist is not so dissimilar. Like, what's needed, you're oftentimes invited, going back to Lawrence Wiener, you're oftentimes invited into a situation to sort of say something or do something. And you do have to think very seriously about context, about where you're operating, what's going on, what's missing from this situation.
Just to reset for my listeners, there is one question, in terms of, like, context, I try to ask every artist, which is, a hypothetical. If you were to sit down at a dinner next to someone who has never met you before and has no idea who Sarah Morris is, how would you describe, how would you describe what you do, what it looks like to this person that is a complete stranger?
Well, I guess I would say that I guess I would say, first of all, that I was an artist and that I make films and paintings that somehow try to picture or capture the way in which we imagine space, the way in which we navigate space, the way in which we navigate cities and people, the way we handle our infrastructure, the way things sort of move, the way, and when I say the way things move, I mean even more nebulous things like power, the way power is configured, the way in which we fantasize about that, all of those things. Sometimes it's not the actual way of the way. For instance, if you look at early paintings of mine, whether they be HBO, Grace Building, or the Revlon Corporation, they don't actually look like that, right? That's the way I want them to look. They're the way I want to display, those sort of signs, and to almost like as an appropriation of space, taking over those elements of, parts of sort of the context we live in. Is that too long of an answer?
No, it's never too long of an answer, Sarah. So your films, your paintings, they're very much tied to coordinates. They're tied to place. They're tied to places. They're tied to times. Is there something in particular about specific dates and times that you find attractive?
I mean, I am interested. I mean, I've always interested in the precision, the seeming the seeming precision of time, which of course we know that everything is connected, right? Like I definitely believe in like sort of duration, the idea of like duration, not specific moments of time, because I think it's impossible. Like if we took a specific moment in time, it's connected to the moment before, the moment after. It's connected possibly to something a few years back. Like there's no way to isolate a specific moment in time. You can try to, but I do think the element of, when I say how do you navigate and how do I navigate, I think about that a lot, about my path through the city, my path, period. Like I think about where my studios have been. I think about sort of moving through time, through history, which now obviously is, you can say, when I say history, history becomes art history, right? So you sort of think about sort of all the conversations that have happened and what is sort of propelling you. So sort of when I think about the calendar, which is an interesting problem now, especially with COVID, it's sort of like, I don't know, I feel like there's become a crater that has happened in the calendar. You know what I mean? Like people have sort of lost some conception of hard time. There's even more of this concept of duration. And that's fascinating to me because that's something I think artists are quite aware of even without a global pandemic. But I think the global pandemic for sure exaggerated a lot of things. And for sure it exaggerated this idea of distraction and concentration and the sort of crazy in-between space between the two, right? Sure. Like what is the state where you're not completely distracted, nor are you completely concentrated? And this sort of pivot between these two states of being is sort of where a lot of people have been for the last 2 years, right? But as an artist, I think you're flicking in and out of sort of concentration and highly sort of relaxed moments, right? Like it's not just one state of affairs, thank God. I mean, you're just sort of moving about.
No, it's really interesting. You're talking about duration. It makes me think of our perception of time, because time is a constant, but our perception of time changes as we get older. But they say, because when you're 5 years old, to get to your 6th birthday, you have to make it another 20% of your lifetime. But sure. By the time you're in your 50s, it's only 2%. And so like each year, our perception of how quickly time is passing is changed. It's always been a really interesting concept to me because, we're always told that time is such a constant.
Well, everything is quite relational. I mean, the sense of, I love that Charles and Raim's film, Powers of 10, because of that sort of issue of scale. You're talking about scale, a child's scale of perceiving time, and perceiving people even, you might know only X amount of people when you're 5, many more people by the time you're 20 and so on. But in some ways, I don't really know if there's any sort of like progression through these sort of experiences because, as I was thinking about it, for instance, I was asked recently by another artist to find a photo of myself when I was 5. And of course I don't have it with me. I'm going to have to go to get it off my parents. But, when I was 5, I don't really think my personality was much different than it is now. Maybe my sense of scale was different, but I'm not even sure about that. I had very precise ideas about the city before I even got to the city. And when I say the city, I mean New York City. It was clear to me that New York City was like a mecca, and that I was definitely going there. And I remember that very precisely the first time I went, which was I was like less than 3. So I don't know. I mean, it's how you perceive things is. I'm not sure if it's a constant or if it changes. I mean, for sure, there's elements of both, right?
Well, that's something that strikes me sometimes also is that, I think about places I lived 20 years ago that I haven't visited in 20 years. And in my mind, that place is still exactly the way I left it.
Yeah.
But in it's just as real in my mind as if if that's the case. But I know that there's absolutely no way that it's exactly the same. And so our perception of of what these spaces are is kind of tied to our memories in time. Philosophy is more your wheelhouse, right?
Well, I mean, I didn't, I did study some philosophy. I studied mainly political philosophy, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert by any stretch. I read a lot of books, and I love reading. I love reading other people's ideas and sort of comparing it to how I'm experiencing um, those phenomenons, whatever they are or whatever politically they are. I like political philosophy, but I like I mean, when I speak about duration, I'm talking about Bergson. Like that to me. That I remember when I read those books, I was really like, that does, the sort of understanding of time and of sort of inner language that happened around the turn of the century, sort of the fin de siècle, turn of the century, 1900, sort of right at the moment before things became industrialized. That's sort of interesting, the writing around that moment. And then what happened next, of course, is a sort of major revolution on the level of what we're probably experiencing now.
So let me ask you, in your opinion, would you consider your films documentaries?
Definitely not. Definitely not. I would never forget once I screened Los Angeles in Los Angeles, right? And I screened it in Los Angeles twice. Once was at screening at Creative Artists Agency, which is the talent agency in LA, and then once because I think it was shown at UCLA, and it was in the sort of running up to the Oscars, and I think the producer of the film and I put it as a possible short documentary. But I remember in the audience, at the university anyway, there was somebody in the audience who was like, "This isn't Los Angeles," and I remember thinking or saying, "Well, of course not. This is like this is the film industry, right? This deals with sort of fiction. This deals with fantasy. This deals with the fact that most actors or actresses are out of work. This is not, this is about aspiration, right? I mean, yes, it documents in the sense I shoot like documentary style. I don't use lights. I use real situations. If you want to call them coordinates, you could call them coordinates. I put myself into certain situations. I'm not necessarily creating them. That script is running through the Xerox machine. That actress is trying out for that role. That casting agent is doing his thing. Brad Pitt is punching himself. Those are all things that were happening. It's just I was there to capture them. And I placed myself in those situations. Of course, you could argue that changed what went down, but maybe in a few examples it did change what happened for the camera, so to speak. But in general, they're shot like documentaries. A lot of the shots are like documentaries, or they're like B-roll from some other film. I mean, I remember when I first started making films, people thought that I had used other people's footage. And I was like, no, this is actually my footage of Chase Bank. This is my footage of, Park Avenue. This is my footage at Penn Station at 5 o'clock. And, the idea that somebody would capture these seemingly, just the sort of transient nature of the movement of the city and these narrative things that are narratives, but you don't know the ending to the narrative, right? You just know that somebody's rushing from Penn Station out with a briefcase. Like, you don't know exactly, it's sort of frustrated narrative, if you will. But no, they're not documentaries. I don't really view them that way.
It makes me wonder whether they may be even more objective than some documentaries.
Well, documentaries are fictional things too. I mean, they can be, because it's like you start out with a theory.
Exactly.
And then you sort of prove your theory by talking to somebody who has the key to whatever you're trying to sort of learn from. I suppose you could look at as my films as documentary in the sense that they're sort of an exploration of a place, but they're probably more David Attenborough than they are documentaries, in the sense of they're like, I look at things as like a habitat, right? And if you look at things as a habitat for everything, even a recipe or a diagram for a painting, if you think about the contacts and Rolodex of Creative Artists Agency, which, by the way, is a painting of mine that's at Museum of Modern Art, was collected by them. But if you think about, the contacts and the sort of diagram of one of those agents' heads,
right,
of like how they're operating and who they're trying to bring up and who they're trying to throttle, and so on, you might get to an image of my paintings. You might be able to sort of derive some sort of a process there. But that sort of that sort of navigation of like taking something up, taking something down, squelching something else, is all sort of this compression that most people in our sort of current configuration of, let's call it sort of late capitalism, that's what people are doing. That's, CAA is just like an extreme example of that, right? And it's just in one field, but the sort of, even the iCal, which I hate iCal so much. I mean, it's the bane of my existence looking at my iCal, because it's like, it has a glitch in it. It repeats people's birthdays 5,000 times. Like, I don't know if I'm the only person this happens to, but anyway, it's like just the carving out of space of iCal is like, tells an entire story, right?
Right.
Tells an entire, I mean, it is a document, right? It becomes the history of the studio or the history of, what I'm up to. But on another level, it's like, it's not just the history of what I'm up to. It's the history of how people are perceiving time and context.
Do you wind up having paintings that are kind of naturally created as physical responses to the films?
Well, it's not that organized. The paintings, even with Midtown, the paintings, because Midtown was the first film that I did, the paintings started before the film, continued after the film. Definitely certain buildings in the film appeared as titles of my paintings, but so there is sort of a map in that regard, but it's not linear. It's not like the films come first and then comes the paintings, or vice versa. It's like everything's happening all at the same time, and sometimes with big lags,
Sure.
But no, it's not so organized like that. I mean, you really could say in a way that the films and the paintings, I mean, they are made by one person, but it could very well be the work of two different artists. It happens to not be, but it could be. You don't have to experience one to experience the other. You don't have to see them in order either. I mean, I don't like the idea of this sort of, I don't really like the idea of the black box of the way people have sort of shown film in art. I mean, I've been lucky enough to show the films in a lot of different spaces around the world. And sometimes we show them, sometimes we do project them in a quote black box. It's like, I'm not so interested in that per se. I like the idea that you could capture a few moments, again, going back to this idea of distraction as opposed to concentration. I think you could watch like 10 seconds of my Beijing film and get it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It might be, I might shoot in 200 locations, but like if you saw a few of them, you would probably be able to understand a certain temperature, which I'm trying to yield,
Right.
and this sort of flickering that goes on. But I don't think you have to, see it all as a whole. There's different levels of like how I view the audience. I think it's okay to just see or understand a fraction. I don't think you have to see the entire whole. Of course, I see the entire whole. Certain
Right.
people see the entire whole, but you don't have to. Like that's not a prerequisite. It's not like it's a mandate that you have to. Although it'd be fun to mandate that, but you don't have to.
So in my imagination, you do a lot of research and you talk to a lot of people and you wind up creating like a shot list, this coordinate at this time, and then you show up and you shoot there.
And something totally different could be happening, by the way. What I project, it could be something like I didn't expect, for instance, on the set of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, I didn't expect for Brad Pitt to punch himself in the face a bunch of times. I mean, I heard they were having all types of problems on the set, but I didn't expect him to do that. I just showed up and that's what happened. So, you have to be sort of ready to capture sort of that anarchic moment. And sometimes the moments are very staged and very intermediated by some other group. And sometimes they're quite raw. And actually that's sort of interesting, those different sort of densities of actually having to deal with that, because it makes it really surprising.
Sure.
Right? Because you don't know, another example of when I was in Beijing, we got there very first night, the producer, who was quite a commercial producer, who basically wasn't gonna work for me, but then I somehow got the International Olympic Committee to do it. And then as soon as I got all the permission, he was like, yes, I'm on it. Right? Like I'm going to work for you. And so I remember we went all out to dinner the first night in Beijing. I was incredibly jet lagged, and somebody said, Kissinger's around. He's here for the opening ceremonies. And
Wow.
I immediately was like, well, he needs to be on the shot list now. Where could we get him? Where could we possibly get him? And apparently he was giving a lecture, we found out, at the University of Beijing. And we went and we filmed him in this amazing sort of auditorium with this chandelier. I mean, it looked like out of Stranger Things. It was like Kubrick mixed with Stranger Things. It was like this chandelier with this incredible light.
So it's like Dr. Strangelove.
Sort of honeycomb structured ceiling. And then before he spoke, Jackie Chan was speaking. And I was like, I can't believe this. How on earth would they have Jackie Chan lined up with Henry Kissinger? And I thought, well, that was quite apt. That's what I mean by being sort of surprised by how things are actually organized by others. I think there's a level of randomness, but maybe not. Maybe there's a whole story. I'm sure there is a story for why Jackie Chan was in the lineup with Henry Kissinger, aside from some sense of irony on the part of whoever was organizing the speakers that day. But, I'm sure there is a story about why, as to the why. Somebody had a logical reason for it, but it doesn't really matter what the logical reason is. That doesn't interest me.
And it just kind of goes back to some of the points we've already discussed, is that when you're planning your film,
Mm-hmm.
you're imagining the narrative based on what you anticipate being at those coordinates, the end product winds up being totally different.
Somewhat, but no, I don't think it ends up being that different than I have in my head. I just think the little details are different. Like, I didn't know that was going to happen. I didn't know that we were going to be shooting, like, the gym, that we would get that we'd have such access to, for instance, the female gymnasts. Like, I didn't know that. I mean, I imagined that we would, but like, I didn't realize that we would get, the balance beam screw ups of the top gymnasts of the world. Like, I didn't really think about that. I just sort of thought, I want to place, I want to have full access, and then we'll dissect the sort of lineup as we have energy and sort of time to do. Because, when you're shooting film, sort of like with anything, time is money. So you have a certain window of time to do it, and it's almost like a game. It's like you have only a certain amount of days to shoot your film. So you sort of prioritize what becomes the most, what you have access to and what seems the most pertinent to the overall image of the film.
Shift gears just a little bit, and that is, I ask you about the parallax view. I've heard you talk a little bit about this movie from 1974.
I love that film.
And interesting story. I grew up outside of Dallas, and the Kennedy assassination is always kind of hanging and lingering in the air. When I was in high school, my U.S. history teacher actually showed the parallax view in our classroom.
Well, that's pretty amazing.
I know.
I wish I had a history teacher like that.
What does that film mean to you?
I think that film means to me several things. It means to me, I liked the idea that you would have this sort of recruiting operation that is this sort of entity that you don't know who they are, and that you're doing a job which you don't really know how it fits into everything else, right? Mm-hmm. Like, when Warren Beatty takes that test and is determined to pass the test with a certain sort of profile, he's not entirely sure. He has a theory, but he's not entirely sure how his work is going to be used, like what he's actually being recruited for. And I think there's an aspect to that in most of our roles, but it's certainly that in the role of the artist. But I guess that's one aspect of it I like. The second I like the idea of an anonymous entity sort of controlling stuff. I like the idea of that. And then the second thing, I like the idea of the disruptor to that, right? I like the person who infiltrates and gets recruited and has their own agenda, right? Which is the sort of Warren Beatty character. I love that. I think there's something quite subversive about that. The idea that it has this background of 70s American politics and this, of taking down progressive sort of characters, or at least sort of like keeping them down, sort of changing, the whole idea of like the conspiracy is something that, we're still grappling with today. Like, there's no end to it, right? I mean, once you get on that, and I'm not saying I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I just like the idea that that basically there are certain entities that are in power that are trying to somehow activate or use our sort of, I don't know, to somehow, I guess I'm trying to say that I like the idea that they're somehow, the parallax view anyway, you have an organization that's trying to sort of control political outcomes, and specifically in that film. And I guess I'm probably, a kid who witnessed, a president resign. That was pretty major. I definitely saw my parents talking back to a television set or speaking about the news. Right. I remember them. I remember even hearing, there was a lot of that in my house anyway. Like the idea of basically realizing what was going on is not what actually is going on, right? That actually there's sort of two soundtracks, right? There's the official soundtrack, and then there's the other version. And so this idea of like basically things are not what they seem, or sort of deconstructing things seemed to be like a normal thing. You know, it's like as normal as cutting the grass, or, you know, having a calendar in your house.
Do you think that influences your work? I mean, could somebody objectively look at your films and say, you know what, is this a little bit about surveillance? You know, especially, you know, when you think about some of your paintings are sort of, you know, satellite level, you know, imagery in some ways, right? I mean, is surveillance in there somewhere, or is that just, you know, me filling in gaps?
I'm not sure if it's surveillance or voyeurism in any sort of like normal sense. Probably more in a sort of morph between sort of like Charles and Reims and Picabia, you know, like, I mean, I'm very interested in the machine. I'm very interested in the idea of fake industry. I'm interested in the idea of currencies and in these sort of flow patterns that sort of are sort of what's making things tick. Like how are these sort of aspects, and I'm not just talking about infrastructure, like proper infrastructure, but like all of these infrastructures, right? Or, you know, I'm not sure if you would even call them infrastructure, but I think it does influence the work, this idea of like looking for the sort of structure of things, trying to figure out how are things organized. And obviously with thinking about that, you're at the same time playing with like the idea that any type of planning of a society is bound to have some level of failure, right? I mean, there's just no way around it with the level of corruption and the level of sort of human psychology, right? So I think there's an element, probably going back to the parallax view, where you just understand that the social forces that are upon us are not what they seem. And I think I probably had a pretty good understanding of that at a pretty early age. Whether that makes me anti-authoritarian, probably. You know, whether that makes sort of one, I think you have to have, you know, the thing about art that is the most interesting to me, aside from all the conversations and the people and the travel and all of this sort of vast, again, connections between all these places and people, is that there is this sort of constant sort of questioning of like what should have priority, what is the sort of dominant culture, what is not the dominant culture. I mean, even if you're looking at very artists that sort of dealt with the marginal or marginalization as a sort of concept in their work, like, and you could look at sort of, I don't know, Paul McCarthy's a perfect example of somebody who's taken that trope. I mean, that has a political side to it, obviously. And I think that's the part about art that I love, is that sort of constant questioning of like how you can choose a thing, a theme, and try to render it visual and have that conversation. Because ultimately I think art is conversations. It's impossible to avoid. Like that's what it generates that, even if it's just in the mind of the viewer. And very rarely is it just in the mind of the viewer, but even if it is just in the mind of the viewer, that's okay.
You know, when I look at your paintings, I think of this website I go to sometimes that is focused around the visual representation of data called Information is Beautiful. And I don't know if you've ever come across this, but you know, it's
I have not.
You would probably love it. I have a number of books by a Yale professor named Edward Tufte who talks about designing around the visual representation of data. And it reminds me a lot of your work, but I'm not always sure exactly what's the underpinning or what. I don't know exactly.
I'm not sure either. I'm not sure either. I mean, basically, of course, I think about, the idea of all the different types of visualization of data. Even like right now, as I'm talking to you, I'm looking at a stop sign in Long Island City, stoplight, that is, which is a brilliant sort of, invention that obviously has a middle ground, which is the yellow, which I love because that's the light you go through, right? But, visualization of data is like everywhere, from 7-Eleven to the stoplight to the subway codes that I'm looking at to trucks going by. I mean, there's so many elements to it, and we actually are quite sophisticated in how we look at, like, even a Coke. Even a Coke can, like, it means something around the world, and it doesn't necessarily just mean, like, a cold Coke. It's not like an autonomous thing. It's a piece of propaganda. It ends up like a sign. It ends up like a flag, as does FedEx.
Right.
I mean, all of these elements are sort of moving around, and they're everywhere. And yeah, I'm looking at things like that as I'm sort of working on the paintings. I'm looking at everything from how I may see something that I think could be done better, it might be that I'm looking at, like, the scaffolding systems of Hong Kong or the matchbooks of Hong Kong. Like, there's many, it's sort of a sliding compendium of things going into the paintings. It's a little bit like a sort of tornado, and then it ends up very quiet, but there's a lot of, I never really want to have too literal or too linear a path to the actual rendering of whatever data I'm using, but there's a lot of things that go into sort of the perspective that I'm trying to build.
The majority of your paintings look very structured and planned, but I've heard you talk about improvisation and and how people kind of underestimate how much improvisation you use. Does that improv happen in the digital design, or does it happen at the point of execution?
Well, nowadays, and for quite a long time, I've always worked on the computer, and the paintings are designed on the computer. And I do my best to sort of work with paint live. And that means that, like, even if I have a painting laid out, planned out, and we're rendering it, like, on the canvas, I will still make a number of changes even as it's, quote, done. And that's gone on for quite a while. So it's not like, the computer can solve all problems to do with scale and that you can plan out everything. You can't, because, like, some things just have to happen in the studio. But certain things happen even improvisationally when I'm in the computer, when I'm at the computer and I'm working on a painting. There's a thing that for instance, mathematically, I might create a certain grid or plan of a diagram. I'll call them diagrams. But again, I don't know diagrams to what, but, like, they are diagrams, right? So I'll be planning a diagram, and then there's certain things that happen where, there'll be an accident that happens using a certain tool. And then I'll realize that actually that creates a different type of space. And I'll end up using that or trying to learn how to use that accident.
Sure.
It's not so dissimilar to sort of things that happen in the films too. There's all sort of levels of improvisation that go on.
But as you describe that, I think of these paintings I saw in your most recent show, Means of Escape, that sort of look like spider webs, and it's almost like these spider webs. How a spider will create a pristine, symmetrical spider web, and then something will happen. Maybe something's caught, webs
you'll
break.
Have something drive through it,
right,
or
and then,
go through it, or it'll rip.
Right. And then there will be these random repairs, right? And, what I'm hearing kind of makes me think of that painting. And are there spider webs in there?
There are definitely some spider webs in there. I mean, at the beginning of COVID, I found myself up in Massachusetts, and I just saw, I was thinking about this condensation of the city, which you hear people, everyone from Rem Koolhaas to so-and-so talking about this, like, that the city is the solution. And then literally we have a crisis and the city is like empty, right? So I was sort of thinking about this congestion, condensation in the city, then it going to empty. Now it's back to full again. And then I was thinking about these provisional structures, these improvised structures, but highly planned, highly engineered, which are these spider webs, and thinking also how ephemeral they are, but how tough they are at the same time. And I thought, as I started to sort of photograph them and found them everywhere, like once you start looking for something, you can start to, it's like looking for the letter S on license plates. Like you'll start to find them, everywhere. So I started seeing them everywhere, and I realized that actually maybe there's something to that idea of the improvisational, and the idea of this other type of organism that's actually sort of also building their habitat and trying to think about survival and thinking about, dealing with all these different predators, and also thinking about their food, So it was just sort of it was like a study for me of looking at another, to me, that I was really thinking about New York when I was making those paintings. The state of New York, the state of also time too, because it's like everything is relational in terms of scale, as we talked about. So if suddenly, even if you're in New York City, which was, as I said, always my mecca, if New York is turned off, like it was during Sandy, and you had half the city off and half the city on, what type of a city is that? What type of a city is a city with no people, or no shows, and what type, it just sort of goes to show that a world, to me, a world without culture is a world impossible to even think about, and when you think about culture, it is produced by a group of people moving somewhat in a random, chaotic way, moving in the same direction. Like it's not possible otherwise. If you think about what's going on in the Ukraine, it's like, obviously culture becomes like a footnote.
Right.
There's no time to think about culture. In fact, I just got an email from Kyiv, because they have a couple of my paintings in the collection there, and they were trying to figure out evacuation. I've never been, but I got an email from them asking if they wanted, if I would help discuss, what the plan was for their evacuation of the museum. And of course, I wrote immediately back and never heard from them again.
Wow.
So I don't know what that means, but anyway, these are all sort of modern, sort of quite sort of current circumstances of thinking about the city and crisis, right?
Sure.
That's what we're all sort of thinking about. Even now we're sort of in this moment of like optimism and whatever. It's still like, what happened with the pandemic, no matter how much anybody doesn't want to speak about this, is it is part of climate change. That seems pretty clear.
Sure. So, Sarah, you I hate to change the subject one more time, but
Yeah.
you have you have a retrospective coming up, right?
I do. I have 2 retrospectives. You're reminding me of it. Don't give me a headache.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There's two. One is in Japan and one starts in Germany. And I tried to get them all on the same page, that it would be the same show, because I just thought maybe that would be better. But the Japanese said no, they wanted to do their own show. So it's actually 2 different shows. One starts in January.
No, I was just going to say, does that mean there are going to be some pieces that have to go from one to the other? But
No, they're 2 separate checklists.
Wow.
2 separate checklists. But, the films, I mean, one reason that I started doing film to begin with, aside from taking over my own set of references and being in charge of my own program, so to speak, like not waiting for somebody to like write about it, but to actually just sort of do it in visual form, like a manifesto, is that you can show a film multiple places at the same time. It has a big advantage over a painting in that regard. And then you add in the fact that people are sort of attuned to watching moving image much more than they are something that is seemingly static. But yes, they have 2 separate checklists, 2 completely different shows with 2 completely different catalogs, that's why I say it's a little overwhelming at times, but I'm super excited about doing them. One starts in January in 2023 in Osaka, and the other one is in Hamburg, and it opens at the Dijkterhallen at the end of April 2023, and then travels through Germany and Switzerland.
So is there a lot of heavy lifting on your part between now and then?
Yes. Yes, because as we know, curators like, at least if you're living, curators like you to do, they want your take on almost everything, right? Which is good. I'm not complaining, but it's just like, you have to, it's about making the checklist. And I'm just watching Seth Price walk through the 7-Eleven parking lot right now. I'm in my kitchen of the studio. Anyhow, because I'll be involved with the books too, right? So we have to find a lot of images of the making of the films and film stills and lots of visual material, and also make sure that like everything is compatible. Now with this whole thing of everything becoming so high res, there's tons of old things that need to get reinterpolated, right? They need to get, unfortunately. But somebody has to do this. So, it's going to have to happen, I guess, in the studio, sort of under my supervision, I guess.
Right.
So, but yeah, there's 2 books coming out for those shows. And the title, I want to just add, the title of the Hamburg show is All Systems Fail. Got it. Which they were a little bit like, when I said that title, they're of course like, it was, I think, in the middle of COVID. It was like deep COVID, actually. When I say deep COVID, it was probably like early 2021. Right. Maybe even late 2020 when I titled the show. But I do like the idea of, I think it's a good thing that people can't be controlled and that things go wrong. Like, I don't see that as a bad thing, that system planning would fail. And, we try as we might, we really do a terrible job of anticipating the future. And so. Well, there were a bunch of people who anticipated this future. That's true. But yes, but believing it is another story, right? Right. But it's definitely, there's a lot of material to deal with. There's a lot of aspects of thinking about how, I'm not even sure. As an artist, I don't even want to think about how things should be structured better. That's somebody else's job. Right. But I can think about how things could be.
Well, it's just, that's micro versus macro, right? You can't worry about, as an artist, maybe how the grand system is designed, but you can, on the micro level, how we can live within that system and process it to the best of our individual abilities, right? How do we process it?
How do we process it? And also, as an artist, you think about how you take things over, right? Like when I think about my Midtown series, or even the way I approach any sort of titling to the paintings and the films, I think about like mapping, my universe, mapping it. And by doing that, it becomes like a form of graffiti in the sense of you're tagging it, you're taking it over, you're appropriating it. And once you take it over, like once you make a film about the Oscars and do it your way, and you realize maybe your way is better than the actual Oscars, which it's not very difficult to do that, right? Right. You actually realize that you've changed the thing itself. Once you're speaking about it and rendering it in this other way, and it becomes shown enough and reproduced enough and discussed enough, it actually changes the original thing. The people who are in power are aware of it. They're aware that they were portrayed like that. They're aware of how, they're highly self-conscious people. So they're aware of it. And the same could be said for, corporate America, which of course they're not as self-conscious at all. Still, if you map out the way, 6th Avenue looked and who sort of dominated that skyline going up 6th Avenue in Manhattan in the late 90s or whatever it was that I did, that was sort of my version of the sweet smell of success. Like, you have this sort of panorama of the powers that be, but they're not even the powers that be now, because actually the thing is that these things are not, they're not permanent. They're all in flux. And that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. That's a good thing that they're in flux, because anything that was permanent would be a problem.
Well, Sarah, I seriously feel like I could talk to you for another hour. I mean, like, we haven't even touched on your time with Jeff Koons.
Well, maybe we should do another session if you want to like get on to all of that, because of course there is a lot of material. So I'd be happy to schedule something else, and we can go into maybe the beginning in New York.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd love to do that. Maybe you want to just edit it in a way. I don't know if I went on.
So No. Our conversation today is exactly what I wanted our conversation to be, and it was it's like one of your films. I set up questions anticipating a line, and it became what it became. But I would somewhere down the line, maybe we could have another conversation, and that one could be about your early days in New York, because that sounds like a really interesting time, and just how things have changed and how the things stay the same.
How things have changed and what I saw. Yeah. I think that would be that could be quite interesting.
Sure. But I appreciate your candor and your openness, and just, being willing to talk. If somebody wanted to keep track of you and your work, where's the best place to follow you, Sarah?
Probably Instagram.
And that's just Sarah Morris?
Yeah.
Awesome. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for asking.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.